Okay, this chapter, chapter 15, discusses a little bit then about the analysis of qualitative data, which is a little bit more difficult because we're dealing obviously with things that are organized in a non-numeric fashion. Probably the biggest thing to start with here is how we draw similarities or differences between these two types of data. One of the biggest similarities is that they both have inferential characteristics. That means that we infer from the data, whether it be qualitative or quantitative. We infer, we make educated guesses that allow us to make a jump from the data to the abstract idea. Both qualitative and quantitative share that characteristic. As well, both types of data have a public method or process involved in them. That means that the process is revealed to everyone and it's done as described. That way that everyone knows everything that's being done and could replicate it if needed. Now, the ability to draw comparisons between specific situations or draw comparisons between concepts is central, and that remains the case for both qualitative and quantitative matters. And not surprisingly, in both qualitative and quantitative data, there is this extreme effort made to try to avoid some errors, make false conclusions, try to avoid making false conclusions and not make misleading inferences or misleading jumps between the data and the abstract concepts. Now, those similarities are important to note because we typically overlook how they are similar. Instead, most of us do focus on how these two methods are different. And the big one, if we look here now on the right-hand side here, the big difference would be quantitative data is standardized because numbers are numbers and they are the same, right? A 1 is a 1 is a 1. Whereas in qualitative, things are less standardized. Also, what we seem to see here is that in quantitative data, you do the data collection first and then you do the analysis. Whereas in qualitative, you're both collecting the data as well as conducting the analysis on the fly. Now, in quantitative data, there is a sort of a linear organization to things such that things are generally deductive, that the data leads me to the concept. Whereas in qualitative, things are a little bit more circular in their organization, meaning that things are inductive, that the process of collecting the data starts to reveal things. And then, obviously, in quantitative data, since we are dealing with numbers, we tend to use statistical analysis, whereas in qualitative, we're not engaged in statistical analysis. And you see these kinds of descriptions outlined a little bit here as well, is that in the qualitative data, you start to see discussion at least of the theory and how it becomes less abstract. There's a great deal of detail given because you're trying to illustrate the context. You're trying to outline a bit more the complexity of the process being engaged in. As well, you're trying to once you have an explanation, since it is not based on numbers, you need to make your explanation or your reasoning behind that explanation seem plausible. And the only way you can do that is by providing that context. Now, that conceptualization, what it does is it allows us to think about how the concepts are tied to the data itself. So that conceptualization has to be grounded in the data. And then once you start to organize your theories and your concepts into themes, you're then organizing your findings, your qualitative findings, into those same categories. And what you're seeing here is that the ideas that you have that come from the theory are quite interdependent or linked to the evidence that you're finding. Now, when it comes to the data, what becomes quite important is that you start to think about how you're going to code it. And we have three different ways, at least, of how we could think about the coding of data. That would be open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. And what we're talking about here with open coding is that this is generally the first stage of the coding process. And what we're doing here is we're trying to find some way to do a first pass to try to think about how we're going to condense the data. And that open coding, that step of trying to think about general codes, general categories, leads us to the axial coding. And in the axial coding, what we're trying to do here is take those codes that we created in step 1 and start to link the codes to one another and allow those linked codes to generate key analytical categories or bigger categories. So basically, your categories are linked codes from your first step. Then in your last stage in the coding analysis, you have selective coding. And what I'm trying to do here is then looking at the codes, using the codes that I have generated to start to think about how I'm going to identify and select all the data that's been generated. And so this kind of helps us organize it pretty well. So this is taken from the textbook, from box 15.3, and it talks a little bit about, for instance, how I would think about the analytic memo writing. So the thing about qualitative research is that there's just so much, there's such a large amount of notes that are being taken. So what this is describing here is one way in which the coding process would help me start to organize the data that's being collected. Now, one thing you have to think about as well as you do this coding and concept formation is that we need to start to think about outcropping. And I like this picture, and again, this comes from the book, but it helps us think about what we're trying to do here as a researcher. There's some level, some plane that is visible to us, and that plane would be right here. And what we're trying to do, right, is that we have some observations about things. We've taken note of these particular points. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to use our understanding of things using qualitative techniques to dig a little deeper, to understand this underlying social reality that exists below the surface. So, outcropping then itself is that understanding process. It's the way in which we try to see events and features, these little circles right here, as representing some deeper structural relations. And so outcropping then becomes a quite valuable part of how you think of yourself as a researcher. So as we start to visualize how this all then looks, we have 3 points of data. In data point number 1, that's just our raw data, our raw experiences, the things that we listen, observe, that we get data through listening, observing, and interviewing. Then once we do that, right, we're taking notes on these things. We're remembering those kinds of things. We're recording in some way those things, which leads us to the second part of the data. This would be our data, our recorded data, the physical record, whether we've written it down or actually recorded it. And then what we're doing is we're analyzing the data, sorting the data, coding the data. And that leads us to part 3, where then we have the processed data that we see in a final report or in a finished analysis. So this part right here is the hardest part. It is what makes a qualitative researcher versus one who is not. Because anyone can do these things. Listen, observe, interview, and then record what they're actually doing. The real value of the researcher comes in doing this last part, in my opinion. Okay, so then we need to think about what those analytic strategies are going to be, right? We're going to think about, going from this, how do we do this in a good fashion? So in this analytic strategy here, one way to think about it would be, we're going to be looking at 7 different strategies here, about how we're going to start to analyze this qualitative data. And the one thing that we could do is start to think about ideal types. These would be the pure standards that we're thinking about, that we're going to be comparing the data against. And within those ideal types, what we're seeing is both a contrast context and an analogy. And in the contrast context, what we're doing here is we're taking on that interpretive approach, and what we're trying to do is look at those ideal types as a way to interpret the data, and we're going to do it. We're going to do that interpretation such that we respect, that we're sensitive to the cultural meanings for the members of that community. And we're going to take from that then analogies. And so in analogies, what we're doing here is we are looking at things, processes, objects that are similar to one another, and we're highlighting those similarities, or just basically what an analogy means here. So we have an ideal type that's here represented by a sun, right? And then we see some representation of it in the raw data. That ideal type, that strategy, would be our way that we think about that ideal type. Now, a different way we could do it is we could engage in some successive approximation. And in successive approximation, what we're doing is we're continually, repeatedly moving back and forth between the data and the abstract concepts. And so since we're going back and forth, each time we're doing it, we're refining our data collection in iterations, or as a process, we're getting, theoretically at least, closer and closer to the truth as we refine our data collection and as we refine the theories that we are taking from. A third type of analytic strategy would be the illustrative method. And in the illustrative method, what we're using here are empty boxes. So these empty boxes are the conceptual categories. And what we're doing here in this analytic strategy is that we're essentially taking the theoretical concepts, putting them, representing them as these empty boxes, and then from the data, we're getting specific empirical examples that we are then putting in these specific conceptual categories. Okay, so a fourth type of way of thinking of an analytic strategy would be with domain analysis. And what we're doing here is we're trying to understand the structure, get a description of the cultural domain. So then the question is, obviously, what is a cultural domain, right? And so here, we're kind of saying here, we're taking the raw data, and we're leading that to a cultural domain. What a cultural domain is it's the way in which people, in the ways in that they interact with each other and they have a shared understanding, how they create mini cultures that can be understood. So an example of that would be, right, we're all Americans from Hawaii all the way to Maine, yet we can think of many mini cultures that exist across those states or even within states. Right, so one helpful analytic strategy I could use would be I could understand how people who live maybe even in Honolulu, right, how they exist differently than people who live over in Maui, right? And I'm sure I could come up with something else. Or even I'd say people who live in Alabama or the southern part of the United States, how they exist different than those who live in New England. So we have folk domains. This would be where the cultural area is based on the argot and the categories are used by the people who are actually in the field. Then I have the mixed domain. Now what I'm doing here is I'm combining both the target and the categories together, but these categories aren't the ones that are used by the individuals in the field site, but rather they are categories that I, as the researcher, have developed. And then we have the analytic domain. And in the analytic domain, what I'm doing here is essentially, I am then the one who's trying to define this cultural area using the categories that I've developed over time. Another method of an analytical strategy would be the analytic comparison. And what I'm doing here is I'm thinking about ways in which I'm trying to find some ways to get agreement or differences that can be discovered using this method. So we have method of agreement then and method of difference. In the method of agreement, what I'm doing here is I'm drawing comparisons across different cases to see how they share a similar outcome. And you see that here, right? Case 1, case 2, case 3, same raw data, and I'm looking at whether things have a similarity of something being present or absent. And then in the method of difference here, well, then the focus is obviously on the differences and how they do not share a similar outcome. So I'm looking, then my focus is on the differences between the cases rather than the similarities. What we could do as well as we're thinking about this is we could start to engage in some narrative analysis. And one thing I would encourage you to do as you're reading the book, I think that what appears on page 525 in the book is actually a really good description of the major features of a narrative. You're going to find it useful for the quiz, but you would also find it useful for the exam. In a narrative analysis, what you're doing here is you're looking at basically historical writings, and these historical writings are telling us a story. And what we're getting here is a chain of events that are chronologically linked together in a typical type of historical analysis. And what the historical analysis is giving us is that certain actors, certain things have had an important role in something happening. And so then within that narrative analysis, we have text, practice, inquiry, and presentation. In the narrative text, this is my story, right? This is my historical format where people and events basically give us the meaning and understanding of our past. Then we have the narrative practice. Now, in the narrative practice, what we're doing here is we're looking at how people experience and give meaning to their daily lives. So that would be like me describing a typical day at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. And I'm doing it subjectively, so I'm doing it from a first-person standpoint. Now, I could also engage in the narrative inquiry. And in narrative inquiry, what I can do is I can look at how basically my general everyday social life has narrative-like qualities. And then finally, there's a narrative presentation. Now, what this is actually coming from is storytelling, or talking story, I guess, in the Hawaiian sense here. And this is where I'm blending everything together. I'm blending my description, my emphatic understandings, and my interpretation all into one thing. And I really haven't had much of a chance to listen to Hawaiians talk story, but I think it's, as a social scientist, when I think about it, it's probably closest to that narrative presentation standpoint or strategy. Okay, continuing on for the narrative analysis now. The types of tools that are going to be used is either path dependency, periodization, or the historical contingency. In the path dependency here is I'm looking at how one thing necessarily leads to another, necessarily leads to another. So there's a chain of events that lead to a pretty identifiable trajectory of things happened. And you can then interrupt that chain of events by removing one thing, and then everything would be fundamentally different afterwards. That gets us both the self-reinforcing and the reactive sequence within the path dependency. The self-reinforcing would be that once something starts, it continues to go on in that way. So the book gives the example of using like a QWERTY KW or QWERTY type of keyboard, but you could think of it in other ways, right? That we drive on the right-hand side of the road, and we always do that, right? Whereas in Britain, they drive on the left-hand side of the road. Those differences are essentially self-reinforcing, and it would be incredibly difficult to changing that. And then there's also the reactive sequence. And in the reactive sequence here, what we're talking about is about how events basically respond to the one that was immediately preceding it. And in this case, in the reactive sequence, I'm not going back all the way to the beginning. Rather, I'm just reacting to the thing that was right before it. In periodization, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the reality that exists, and I'm dividing things into segments or into periods of time, and that these periods of time have general characteristics of things being followed. And then we also have the historical contingency within the narrative analysis. And then in that case, I'm looking at a combination of factors, and there might be a critical junction where there's a whole series of events that come in just to a unique interplay at one point of time to give us a new reality. Now, what we have as well as a different type of analytic strategy is the negative case method. And in the negative case method here, what we're doing is we're focusing on cases that basically that are basically the exception to the rule, or things that don't conform to what the theory tells us should be the case. And we do this negative case method so that we can start to refine the theory. Now, to do this negative case method, we need to follow the steps of the events of identifying the events that do not occur, seeing the events where the population is unaware that they're occurring, or what would be certain events that the population may want to hide, overlook, right? What am I as a researcher perhaps overlooking or not looking at? What are my own biases in going into it, and what types of things are not reported, either consciously or unconsciously? What I would encourage you to do, without going into more detail on each of these things, if anything, I just said you want even more information because you think that your own research is going to be linked to this, I would look at box 15.7 on page 530 in the book. It has a pretty good in-depth description of each of these. But I don't want to spend too much time on it, if only because I want to try to keep these videos to reasonable lengths of time. Now, there's a bunch of other kind of analytic text strategies that I can start to do, that I can start to use to think about things. And what these types of strategies focus on is the way in which I can understand variety as existing. And one of them would be that I could engage in some network analysis. In a network analysis, I'm basically drawing connections or mapping connections among people, organizations, events, things. Alternatively, I could engage in some time allocation analysis. This is where I'm looking at the way in which people spend their time on things. Basically tells me something about their priorities, about their conduct, right? It's for one thing to say, I care about my child's education. It's a different thing to say, I spend an hour a week or an hour a day or an hour a month reading to that child. That reveals different things. Then we have the flowchart and time sequences. This is where looking at the order of events and how things are related to each other reveals something to me about the strategies being involved. I could also engage in the multiple sorting procedure. This would be I look at how people categorize for themselves their procedures. I could also have diagrams, which give me a visual representation of what's going on, or I could have maps, where I get some way of looking at how things are organized spatially. Now, if you're doing qualitative analysis, you really do need some type of software to start to think about how you're going to organize everything. And so there you could use either text retrieval, where I'm looking at keywords, text-based managers, where I'm sorting general lines of dialogue, where I'm sorting the information in that way, or I could use programs that build on the codes that I've developed. And what this all leads to is, in some sense, this kind of event structure analysis. And so I just kind of want you to look at this chart, because what it does is it allows me to see that structure as existing behind those different events. And that's kind of on some level what these qualitative techniques are trying to do as well.